Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Phil Romine. I serve as the Congregational Engagement Coordinator here at Interfaith Action. And I want to welcome all of you to our final event for the Building the Beloved Community Public Safety Project. So tonight, we are going to be hearing from several folks about the scope and the impact of the conversations that we've been having over the last several months. And before we dive in, though, I wanted to give a quick shout out to all of the members of our planning team, past and present, who are here tonight. So if you just give a quick wave when I call your names, hopefully we can capture you on the shared Zoom screen. So from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, Commissioner John Harrington. We have Community Affairs Director Nicole Archbold. And I believe, I'm not sure if they got on, but Communications and Media Relations Director Howie Padilla and Deputy Communications Director Jen Longacre. From Interfaith Action, Executive Director Randy Eilis Roth. Our extremely generous textual scholar, Professor Earl Schwartz, and our former Director of Congregational Engagement and Opportunities, St. Paul, who kept this project humming for so very, very long, Sarah Paterka, is on the call as well. From our world-renowned evaluation team, Utilization Focused Evaluation, who are the collectors and the analyzers and the evaluators of the data that were generated by this project, Michael Quinn Patton and Charmaine Campbell Patton. And finally, I'm not sure whether or not these folks were able to join us this evening, but I wanted to give a shout out to the folks who helped us put together our source book guides for Buddhists, for Christians, for Jews, and for Unitarian Universalists. Ben Connolly, Wade Piper, Professor Earl Schwartz, again, Rebecca Gonzalez Campoy, and Jess Hunt. Now, we know that each of you put in so many hours preparing and gathering folks in your houses of worship, leading conversations, lending your voices, listening deeply. We hope that our time together tonight honors the work that all of us have put in to building a better system of public safety, one that's informed by the deepest roots of our religious traditions. Now, before I turn it over to Randy, really quick, one note about questions. We will have time for questions later on in the hour, but feel free to go ahead and put questions in the chat as they come up for you. I will be paying attention to those questions and sifting them, collating them, and we might have the chance to address some of those during Q&A. And if you put a question in the chat and want to ask it during Q&A live, that's fine too. Just go ahead and use the raise hand button so we can know to call on you. I'll now turn it over to our Executive Director, Randy Roth, to continue the conversation. Randy?
Thank you, Phil, for that wonderful kickoff. And it's wonderful to see all of you here. Thank you for coming back and wrapping up this section of study with us. Interfaith Action believes that opportunity grows and poverty recedes when people of faith invest themselves in effective action. And this is one piece of that action. The genesis of this piece of work is that Interfaith Action has a program called Clergy Civic Engagement. And we pull together clergy from all of our other program work, from Project Home, the shelter for families with children in Ramsey County, from our Department of Indian work, from our legal clinics, from our Opportunity St. Paul program. And we give those clergy an opportunity to be in dialogue with elected officials and other policymakers. We had such a session with Commissioner Harrington just before COVID hit. And then Commissioner Harrington knew us, and he came to us when lockdown happened to pull together houses of worship statewide to talk about House of Worship COVID safety. And we had Zoom meetings with 70, 80 participants over and over again about every aspect of how can houses of worship function safely during COVID. And then as that maybe was coming to line meld, George Floyd was murdered. And then unrest unfolded, and the commissioner's office was engaged in Operation Safety Net. And the commissioner asked if we could pull the houses of worship together again so that he could report back to faith communities on Operation Safety Net. So we had a series of meetings about that. And in those meetings, the commissioner touched on the topic of remaking policing and said that he wished, in an offhand comment, he said that he wished he could get a broad set of voices from the faith community sharing what faith informs communities to think about how we might approach remaking policing. And we took him up on it and started brainstorming together. And we put together a rock star team of the commissioner's office. The commissioner himself was very involved, Nicole Archibald, and the communications team, right now represented by Howie Padilla. We brought in Professor Earl Schwartz from Hamline University to help us with the text aspects and to vision the entire project. We brought in Michael Quinn Patton and Charmaine Campbell Patton from Utilization Focused Evaluation. You might never have heard of it, but they are the evaluators of the world, and a strong team from Interfaith Action. And together, we entered into a design phase. And the design started with asking the commissioner to articulate the key dilemmas faced in policing. What are the things that happen fairly often where values come into conflict and reasonable people could differ about what should happen? The commissioner prepared those dilemmas. Then with Earl's leadership and Phil's work and the whole team that Phil just mentioned, we prepared text study for a wide range of religions on these dilemmas. And then we recruited 25 houses of worship, about 900 people, to study these dilemmas. And then we did the really hard work of, for each of the three dilemmas, the leadership team met and tried applying faith text to the dilemma. And then those leaders went to their own congregations and did the same thing, bringing faith texts to bear on daunting, real-life, pressing dilemmas. And then the whole time this was going on, the utilization-focused evaluation team actively engaged in what I would call developmental evaluation with us, being in from the ground floor, helping us build the strongest program we could, listening carefully, collecting data, reflecting back data, and letting us make real-time adjustments to do our best. So with that introduction, I am now gonna turn the speaking rectangle over to Earl and ask Earl to talk about the importance of looking to our foundational religious texts to analyze these matters.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, one and all. Thank you to all the participants in discussions in congregations and circles throughout the state. Thank you to the team that put this initiative together. Thank you that we have a Department of Public Safety interested in engaging in this way. As members of congregations and worship circles, we've come to the questions with which we've been grappling with a dual responsibility. The responsibility, first of all, to carefully engage our respective sacred traditions, while thoughtfully and honestly engaging our fellow congregants. And these twofold responsibilities were woven into the approach we've employed. An approach that I would say has called us to first, each think for ourselves, and then listen to one another. As we listened across the ages to voices from our traditions, the voices of prophets and teachers at just enough distance from our fears and self-deceptions that they might just see us and our circumstances more clearly than we can sometimes see ourselves. And so our approach has been to think, and then to listen, and then to listen, and then to think again. And I would only add, talk about countercultural. Each of us are, of course, constituents and possible advocates. But our shared objective in this effort has been to engage these questions, first of all, not through assertions and contentions, but at the level of lived human experience with all of the ensuing complications. And then to gather ourselves around these dilemmas rather than retreat to our corners, and there to think and listen, and then listen, and then think again together. I think it's been our great good fortune to have accompanied one another and to have been accompanied by our sacred traditions along the way. Standing amid ever widening circles of experience and inspiration, from right here and now to my neighbor sitting next to me in the discussion circle, to those who have gathered together to pursue this project, congregation by congregation, and then back through time and space by way of our traditions. Standing amid these widening circles, every one of us, of course, has the right to speak our minds. But I think, what a gift, what an opportunity to have spoken with one another and with and through our sacred sources as we do. And in doing this, we've borne responsibilities which I think have imbued our responses to the questions with which we've grappled with a precious added measure of thoughtful awareness. Thanks to one and all.
Thank you, Earl. Thank you. And now I'd like to shift us for a moment to Charmaine and Michael to give us an overview of the data responses, the report synopsis, and thoughts about how this process may have been depolarizing.
Thank you, Randy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to just give you some visuals about what we did together, quantitatively first and then some qualitatively. So when we look across the 3 sessions, we had 25 houses of worship, primarily urban Protestant, but we did have 3 Jewish, 3 Catholic, 2 Buddhist, and 1 non-denominational as well. And started with 24 and lost a few and picked up 1. And so that kind of is how the breakdown of the sessions goes, as you can see. And these are all of the participating houses of worship that we had. So really good to see so many of you here, and want to really thank you, those of you who were the documentarians of this effort, because we really read through everything that you sent, the 59 summaries of what came out of your conversations, looked different in every house of worship, and really tried to look across those different summaries to identify what were the common threads, what really rose to the top. And so when we look at actual participants, there were 911 in those sessions. Some of those were repeats probably, so that's not a unique number, but for the 3 sessions, primarily older white congregants, although there were some who participated from in primarily BIPOC groups, incarcerated individuals, a youth group, and some from Anti-Racism Book Club, Course on Social Change. So some were reflective of the congregation, others were specific groups. And as we looked across the 3 scenarios, the values that really rose to the top from what we saw from you all were the sanctity of life, the safety and attention around whose safety are we talking about when we say safety, the importance of the presumption of innocence and keeping an open mind, justice and equality, mutual respect and trust, de-escalation, nonviolence, and do no harm, empathy and compassion, humility, humanity and dignity, mindfulness, patience, and wisdom. And those came through in different ways, and some were strengthened after the text study, and some, we saw from the very beginning and really held through the course of conversations. And from the notes that we read and from what we heard from you, the key takeaways that we really saw across the different scenarios were an acknowledgement of the complexity of situations, empathy for the challenge of making split-second decisions, the need for better training to ensure police are not acting out of fear using force as a first resort, needing to address the police culture of a warrior mentality, a recognition that many issues are systemic and police should not be the only ones involved, that people deserve respect regardless of what they've done, and a focus on safety over law. So what we did was we took those takeaways and turned them into 4 proposed principles that we felt like would capture the priorities of this group based on the conversations that we could bring forward to the Department of Public Safety, the legislation, as capturing what this group felt like were the key action points. And so those 4 proposed principles are to acknowledge the complexity of public safety challenges. Rather than seek simple answers to public safety challenges, base policies and practices on priority values while acknowledging and addressing tensions. The second is take a systems approach to public safety. Work across agencies to identify and address systemic issues like homelessness, food insecurity, racism, domestic violence that are impacting situations where peace officers may be the first to respond. The third is to shift police culture towards a guardian model of public safety, support peace officers with training to move away from the warrior mentality of policing, to prevent unnecessary use of force and encourage collaborative problem solving. And then the fourth is to foster respect and empathy between peace officers and the community. Build awareness of the impact of systemic injustices, the challenges of making split-second decisions, and other factors that play a role during crisis situations. Foster stronger relationships between all involved. And so we present those to you all tonight, and we will return to these after we hear from the commissioner to really dig into them a little bit and get your perspective. So we have some Mentimeter questions to ask you to respond to these. You'll see them again. Just want to give you a moment to take them in and know that we will return to them, and you'll have other chances to view them as well. So that's from kind of a content standpoint, what we saw coming out of these conversations. And then we'll also spend some time tonight looking at the process itself and how you felt about it, your experience, and what might come of it from, other opportunities to engage. And so some of the suggestions that we've heard so far are to incorporate different perspectives into the scenarios, consider alternatives to text studies that allow for more personal stories and connections, provide more opportunities for congregants, not just leaders, to interact across houses of worship, and to diversify faith community participation. So we'd love to hear other pieces of feedback tonight. And as I said, we'll have a chance to do that in a moment. I just wanted to leave you with a couple of quotes from you all, from your reports. These are complex situations that require multifaceted approaches to improve outcomes. It will require a lot of self-evaluation and a willingness to change on the part of all involved parties. And thank you for doing this as it encouraged more real, honest dialogue among my church folk. I'm praying that this has a real impact in St. Paul and beyond. And so we do as well, and we will talk about what that will look like. Michael, do you want to add anything at this point?
Just to reinforce that the dialogues around the scenarios and the text with each other emerge as an important example of how to dialogue in this polarized time. Randy mentioned the effect of depolarization, and the process involves people not just randomly or abstractly sharing opinions about things, but dealing with concrete scenarios in the context of text and in the context of questions to address. And that's a dialogue model that does, the evidence suggests here, help depolarize and move us beyond beginning baseline abstract opinions into the concrete complexities of situations. And therefore, the systems piece is not a small thing. We're hearing more and more about trying to have systems understandings around issues of society and racism and homelessness and community safety. These are big shifts in how we think about things. And being a part of that helps move the entire community in that direction. So we look forward to engaging with you around those and appreciate the leadership of the commissioner in making this happen.
Thank you so much, Charmaine and Michael, for this report and for those comments, Michael, and for all the work you've put into this over all this time. Really, you've elevated the level of the work tremendously, and thank you. And now it's time for us to hear from the commissioner. We're interested, of course, in anything that's on his mind, but also in what do you think came out of our conversations around each scenario, and how might you plan on using the results of the evaluation that were just shared with us, as well as a short, brief report, maybe a one-pager with a couple pages behind it that will summarize what came out of this.
The concept is short with me, Randy, is always a challenge. For many of you that know me, I'm a recovering politician, and so the concept of a short answer does not seem to really exist, but I'm going to try. I will give it my best college effort. I want to start out by saying that the idea behind this, as Randy kind of chronicled, this started with a conversation around homelessness and about what police and community could do around homelessness and about police community relations. That really dates back even to when I was at Transit Police. But then the accelerator got pushed when we were in the midst of COVID, and I realized that they were looking to me to say, well, what should cops do if they find a pastor preaching on a Sunday? And that didn't make any sense to me, because the idea that we're going to arrest the Archbishop seemed like a really bad idea on almost every basis. The other thing I will say, though, is that this is anchored in a work I did back in St. Paul, and it's anchored in a kind of two weirdly disconnected phrases. The first phrase is see something, say something, and do something. It's your classic Homeland Security phrase that pays, that says, if you see something out of place, you should say something to somebody about it, and then you should try and do something about it so that something bad doesn't happen on its own. The other person I have to anchor this to is Ellen Pence. Those of you who don't know Ellen was the grande dame of domestic violence theory. She worked out of Duluth, and she was the leader of Praxis. And when I was struggling with the most frequent violent crime in the city of St. Paul, Ellen came and said, we need to completely unpack the system if we're going to understand how to fix it. That simply tinkering around the edges or pulling at the individual threads was never going to be successful in trying to actually get to solutions. And so we unpacked an entire system around domestic violence. And what I felt like we were doing in these conversations was we were unpacking the system. This is the beginning of the unpack, though. This is like, you just got home from the trip and you're just taking the first layer of clothes out of the suitcase. There's a lot more stuff in that bag that we got to take out. I want to thank, before I get too much further into this, I want to thank the congregational leaders who stepped up and did this. I have a lot of friends in the clergy, imams and rabbis and pastors and priests, and I know how busy you are. It always struck me when I was a precinct commander and even as a chief of police, I would go by a church for a community meeting and the pastor or the rabbi would be running in from having done the 8 other things that they had to do also. And we asked them to add not just one more thing, we asked them to add a big lift and a heavy lift. It was a heavy emotional lift and a heavy intellectual lift. And it was also a heavy organizational lift because they were pulling their congregants together to have these conversations. And these are challenging congregations. So I really do appreciate that. I recognize that it took time. And I also recognize that there were many places of worship that could not, they were invited to the project, but they couldn't make this work for a lot of good and sundry reasons. And it strikes me that, while I have been having some conversations with some of those congregations who didn't make it to the conversations, but we're still having this congregation, Margaret Mead's line that you never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. It is both the group that showed up and the group that I'm having these conversations with. They're both changing the world and they're changing it for better. But it's an incremental change, and I recognize that. I want you to know that I'm committed to continuing these conversations with you and with others and with Interfaith, who has been my rock star partner throughout all of this, and that we're going to continue to share what we've learned as we continue to work through what the next iteration of this project is. Randy, who has been my anchor throughout all of this, Phil, Sarah, who started this project with us, Nicole, who helped really anchored me to coming to Interfaith when we were looking for resources and partners during COVID, Professor Schwartz, who I've taught with, Dr. Michael and Charmaine Patton. We could not have done this without you. And I really am deeply, deeply appreciative of that. Very quickly, I chose 3 scenarios, and I will own for anyone here that has a question, they're cop scenarios. I've done 45 years as a cop. I grew up at age 12 dreaming of being a cop. That's my world. That's the lens that I see my world through. And so to the extent that these are projected through that lens, I own that because it is my lens. It is the world that I oftentimes see the world through. And I appreciate you helping me look at it in a different light. The 3 scenarios I chose a traffic stop. I chose a verbal domestic that had an unsheltered family. I chose a parlor call that could have ended up in a deadly force encounter. Why did I choose those? I chose them because of Dante Wright. I wanted to name the name here. Who died at the hands of a Brooklyn Center officer at the end of a traffic stop gone terribly, terribly, tragically wrong. I chose it because of Lacey Jo Krug. Most of you probably don't know that name. She's a homeless woman who was beaten to death when she was seeking shelter. And I see all too often, because I still work a lot in domestic violence, the violence that is committed against women, especially those who are unsheltered. And so that brought that particular topic to mind. And finally, I chose it because I chose it for every cop who has hesitated and who didn't pull a trigger that we never hear about in the papers. It happens every day. And you'll never know about them because those are the tragedies that were averted because the cop had the right values, had the gut sense or whatever else. I compliment those folks because they are doing it the way we all want them to do it, and they're not going to get a medal, and they're not going to get recognized, and they're not going to get an award for it. But they are legion out there that are doing it the right way, and we need to reinforce that that is the right way, and we need to reinforce that for the cops on the streets, and we need to reinforce it for our policymakers. I chose these in no small part because I knew that having worked with Professor Schwartz before, that establishing the guiding questions would lead to some takeaways that not only would help and sharpen our conversation, they'd help me. Because this is very often an echo chamber that you work in state government. You hear what people want you to hear, and there's a lot of folks that blow smoke. And I knew that Earl would not blow smoke. I knew Earl would call the question. He would bring clear and precise and thoughtful, textual, religious messages out of the conversations that would help me take a different look at it. And I really do appreciate that work, that because I know that was hard work. What are we doing with this, and what has happened with this? These conversations have allowed me to have critical conversations with law enforcement leaders, the chiefs of police, the sheriffs of the state, our county, local, our municipal, our state assets, and including our federal partners. I recently had conversations with Homeland Security, also having conversations with FBI. These conversations enlighten each and every time we have a conversation around how does community and police work together. As I recognize that we are in that network of mutuality that Dr. King spoke to, that really brought me to the idea of a beloved community. And Rick Heidegger and my friends at Ujamaa Place that helped me when we went back down to Selma to walk the bridge. It clearly is a world where what affects one of us individually affects us all. What affects that cop on the street in Brooklyn Center affected everybody else in the state of Minnesota and beyond. What affected George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, is having still to this day ripple effects on how policing is done. And it has to have those ripple effects. And so this has enlightened those conversations with professionals, but it's also enlightened my conversations with elected policymakers. From the governor of the state of Minnesota, who I am right now in the midst of, as you asked me, what am I doing today? I'm in the midst of pitching a budget for the 2023-2024 biennium. And that budget that we pitched to the last legislative session that didn't get so far was enlightened by this. It was enlightened by conversations saying that we need to help communities heal, that we need to create training for cops so that they are empowered to make the right decisions. That was part of that conversation that I've had with Governor Walz, that I continue to have with legislative leaders, and many of which I want you to know tell me that their pastors, their priests, and their rabbis are very interested in these conversations because these are topics that are going to come before them as laws or bills or requests for funding. Through the course of this last year, we have taken your thoughts and we have tried to apply them to legislative funding and policy. And for that, I am in your debt. And as we get hopefully ready for a new legislative session, starts in January, whether I want it to or not, I want you to know that these ongoing conversations will continue to shape those conversations, both publicly and privately, that will shape public policy. Frankly, those cannot simply be conversations between me and the elected officials, though. And so Randy talked about a report that I hope we will write. I trust that we will write it, a letter that we can write. But what I really hope for is more than that, quite honestly. I'm hoping that each of you individually and or collectively, as is your want, will reach out and touch the elected community and your community leaders to talk about what we've talked about here. I think your local chiefs of police need to know what the values are that you see for policing. I think your local public safety leaders need to know that. I think your local mayors and county commissioners all need to hear this story because I think it will move them and I think it will change hearts and change minds. And on that, probably already over time, I'm going to hand it back to Randy.
You're perfectly on time. I have to say, it's pretty awesome to hear, Commissioner, how these conversations and the deep dive in this work has input into an evolving reality under your leadership. It's really humbling to hear it. And I think I'm speaking for many of us, not just myself. And it's a privilege to have an opportunity to participate in it. And now I'd like to pivot a little bit to a process issue and start off this way. You heard the commissioner say that it would be useful to him in this work to have a report, and we're talking about a one-page summary of what happened here with maybe a few pages behind it, with the recognition that for the most part, in most settings, only the one pager is going to get read. Okay, so the one pager really needs to say it. And so what I'd like to talk to you about for a few minutes is what kind of process we might need to go through among us to come to a consensus that we, these 25 houses of worship, will put our house of worship name on this document. Because it's one thing for the commissioner to have a document with no names on it, and it's another thing for him to be able to say, these conversations that I'm telling you the results of happened between 25 houses of worship. Here's their names. But of course, we'd never put your name on it without your permission. So what we have tonight, and Charmaine, if you could share, please, the poster version. What we have tonight is just the text of the 4 principles. You saw it a few minutes ago. We're gonna share it with you again. And within the next few weeks, so those are the 4 principles you saw. We acknowledge the complexity of these challenges. Our learning together has brought us to believe that there should be a systems approach, that we think it's important to shift culture, peace officer culture towards a guardian model of public safety. And we should foster respect and empathy between peace officers and the community. So that is a rough first draft of 4 principles. What's going to happen over the next couple weeks is, first of all, we'd love to hear comments from you about these things. And in a moment, you're going to have a real-time opportunity to weigh in right now through the Mentimeter process. And you can sure write to Phil and me and Nicole, whoever you prefer to write to, and we'll take those comments into account. But we'd like to have a one-pager with a little bit more text on it, maybe describing the process a little bit more by mid-November. So we'd like to send this one-pager out to all 25 houses of worship mid-November. And what I'm asking you right now is not to weigh in on the substance, but the process question of, if you get it mid-November, can you get back to us with a vote? Either yes, put our name on it, or no, don't, by the end of the calendar year. Is that a realistic time frame? I know that if you know one congregation, you know one congregation, right? Every house of worship has a different set of practices to approve a document. So I'm saying it's great if you could just weigh in the chat. That would help me. And then when we get to Q&A, I'm asking you to please engage that question as soon as we get into dialogue with each other. So with that, I think we're gonna turn to Charmaine to get some Mentimeter responses to the questions we've discussed.
Yes. So think you all are familiar with Mentimeter, at least those of you who've been with us before. It's a way for us to gather real-time polling, both quantitative, qualitative information. So I'm putting a link in the chat and I'm going to ask you, I'm going to share my screen again. First and foremost, to if you can open that link, or you can go to menti.com and use the code 21563401 if the link doesn't work for you, or if you want to use a different device. I'll give everyone a moment and I'm going to put the code in the chat as well, although it's also up on the screen. To ask you to weigh in on how adequately these 4 principles capture what came out of the conversations with your house of worship. We know that there was a lot that you all discussed, and there's no way for us to share every single thing. And we want, as Randy said, to create something that's really easily digestible and useful for the commissioner. So how adequately did we do? So go ahead and put in your response. We'll wait for you. And you don't have the full, these are the titles here, but we'll be sure to get you the full text as well so that you can read them again.
In Mentimeter, in this scaling, the shadow shows the distribution of responses, and the number, this is a 3-point scale. So the number shows where you are in aggregate on the 3-point scale. And in the bottom right, you can see how many people have responded. So 18 people have so far responded. And they're all pretty well in the same high range, 2.7 to 2.9. Given the number of houses of worship, we're pretty well represented here.
That's true. We've got 21. You're right. All right. So the next question is, what, if anything, is missing from these principles to capture your conversations? So this allows you to give sort of a short answer. If there's something that you remember coming out of your conversations that you feel like has really needs to be represented that wasn't in here. Consistency on whether we talk about police versus peace officers. We talked about that yesterday. Commissioner, do you want to address that comment here? Because we talked about it yesterday.
Very briefly, you have police officers, you have peace officers, you have conservation officers, you have troopers, you have investigators, you have agents. And what I was looking for was a term that would encompass all of them. And the term in state licensure is peace officer. And frankly, for me, and speaking not just for me, I guess in this case, but I think peace officer is both an aspiration as well as a definition of what licensed officers who have enforcement powers in the state of Minnesota are called. So that was where that term came into.
And one note about this, the reason that we're using these principles is because we recognize that these conversations didn't give you all a lot of details about who might be involved and committees and things like that. And so the sort of how to implement things is really kind of that next step. And we will talk about that coming. And this is more about principles are really guiding statements that provide direction without being so specific that they have to be implemented within only one specific context. So we're really trying to provide some guidance without being so specific that, you know, if something changes, you have to change the whole thing. Randy, do you want to say anything more about that, or why you went this route?
I'm so sorry, Charmaine. I was
Oh.
responding to comments in the chat while you were
You're fine.
speaking. So
No problem.
It's about principles versus detailed practices, Randy. Why go with the principles approach?
Oh, I see. Because I listened to the commissioner speak about the impact of this work, not just in St. Paul, not just in Minnesota, but nationally and across different divisions of police officers. And so practices are so place specific, and principles give you the place to operate out of that in the way that makes sense for the place that you're in. I guess that's my answer. Does that make sense?
So thank you. We'll take a look at these comments and talk as a group about how and what we can incorporate. And some of the things you're saying, I think, can come in other ways, be incorporated not so much in the principles, but in other surrounding contextual information that we provide. And some I think are definitely potential looking forward changes we can make in the future. So I appreciate your feedback. We're going to move on now from the principles to the process, but is there any other comments from Randy, Michael, or Commissioner or Professor Schwartz about the principles you want to make at this point?
Michael, do you want to comment on principles?
I would only add that it seems to me that, especially for faith communities coming together, that it is more appropriate in the dialogues to find shared meaning at the level of principles than concrete practices. Concrete practices vary across faith communities as well, but we find some common principles at a level that provide guidance, and as you said, have to be interpreted in context. And the other thing that's emerging is principles are very much related to guiding systems changes. Because of the complexity of systems, they don't lend themselves to highly concrete practices because they're so situational and contextual, as you suggested. So principles are especially appropriate for complex dynamic situations. And part of what creates polarization, I think, is narrow definitions of universal practices that people argue about and miss the overarching principles where they might find common ground.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you very much.
Go ahead,
Charmaine?
Charmaine, the next one.
Great. Yep. So think about the process. We'd love to hear from you about what was most valuable about this process from your perspective. I'll read some off as we go. See them popping up here. Entering into dialogue with each other, even when we started with opposing views. Awareness of privilege and impact, fully knowing that it will have a larger impact. Dialogue coming out of both of the scenarios and the application to text or faith tradition, discussing multiple points of view as we were grappling with a very complex issue. Allowed for a thoughtful, soul-expanding exploration of one of the most important public issues of our time, grounded in religious teaching and ethics. Much better understanding of the breadth of police activities. Direct, focused, civil, allowed for this summary without a lot of complex wordsmithing. Thinking together is a form of action.
Charmaine, a few people are putting their Mentimeter responses in the chat because they're having technical difficulties. Will you put those in, or do you want me to be typing them in right now? What works for you?
I will save the chat and get them in there later. And we can just share it. We can put them in a different format. Yeah, thanks. And yeah, we'll put all of this together as always and share it back with you all.
Thank you.
Some more coming in here. Contributing to an eventual solution, hopefully, learning a great deal about complexities and the way situations are typically handled, engaging with sacred texts in this way shaped the conversation and helped us make practical, contemporary connection to familiar texts. Having to consider two perspectives at once, textual analysis changed and deepened the conversation. And dilemmas, police perspective from Chief Harrington. Great. So, there's a few more popping in and then we'll move on. One more minute here. Opportunity to talk about the different scenarios and imagine what life is like for people interacting with the police. And then what, if anything, might improve the process in the future? Assuming we do something like this again. More diversity in houses of worship. More detail about how the feedback is being used, more networking and communication, bring a friend, hearing other perspectives during the leader gatherings, how to offer that to a wider audience, a little simpler, fewer steps, might have been able to engage more congregants and congregations that way. More voices from law enforcement.
Mhm.
Intercongregational dialogue. I see in the chat having people talk and wrestle together about real public issues, include peace officers in the conversation. Great ideas, feedback, thank you. Additional interaction across faith traditions. A little bit more about the history of police brutality. Appreciate the celebration. Short feedback examples about how input was helpful ongoing. Today's the first we're hearing about our helpfulness. Great. And we just have a final slide, I believe, about your interest in two aspects. One is continuing in a process like this to address other pressing issues facing communities, either with DPS or another state agency. And if you have specific issues you're interested in tackling, please put those in the chat. It's hard to do that here. And then also, how interested are you in further information about ways to get involved, specifically moving these principles forward? Great. Seems like there's quite a bit of interest. It's great to see. And I know that Phil has plans to also follow up. Not everyone is able to be here, and so we'll have another opportunity to provide your feedback after this as well, but wanted to get some real-time feedback, allow you to see one another's feedback, and really appreciate you engaging with us in this way. So I think that's our last one, and I will turn it back to Randy.
Thank you. This was
Mhm.
fabulous. I love Mentimeter. Thank you. And now we're opening for Q&A time. And I'm going to start by asking Phil, does he have any saved up questions from the chat?
Yeah, so I wanted to just call out earlier on, there was a question about asking about specifics. Here, can you please share an example of feedback and knowledge you got, and this was directed to the commissioner, from this project that impacted proposed legislation? And Commissioner Harrington, I know you responded in the chat, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about that, and it did show up in the Mentimeter a little bit as well. So I think this would be a good time to hear your responses.
Sure. So both in last year's legislative session, because we'd already started this as I was dealing with the legislative session, the whole issue around community healing was a multi-million-dollar effort that came out of these conversations and was in our budget. So that was, and it's a conversation. It wasn't the only place I've ever had that, because Nicole and I heard that when we were doing the Deadly Force Encounters Working Group also. But it really became an issue, and it was an issue that we could actually have good conversation with some of the legislators who said, they were very interested in trying to figure out how to help communities that have gone through the riots or gone through a police-involved shooting, how do they recover their center and reestablish themselves as a whole? So that was one place that, even last year we were looking at. On this year's legislative priorities, and all of this is still in I'd say in process, because nothing really is established until we can present them to the governor and make some decisions there. But we're proposing, for example, a traffic safety council, which would bring in communities of color into a conversation about how does traffic safety work and what are some of the benefits of doing traffic safety. We know, for example, that one of the things I don't think most people recognize is that fatal crashes have a disproportionate impact on African American communities. There are some crimes that have a disproportionate impact. And so the actions we take to resolve those crimes, whether it's speed cameras or other things, oftentimes are designed to impact communities of color. But it doesn't look that way when you see the advertisement that we're going to do ticket or click it, or it's a DUI sweep period. We recognize that is an area that we could do more with. Lots of conversation, and this is a passion of mine, around really doing more with a blueprint for safety that would be statewide. And that really speaks to issues of, how do we get community resources to link up with investigatory resources? And then in particular, one of the things that I know is going to make an impact is if we can find ways to fund domestic violence housing. So much of the domestic violence in the homelessness community that we see, or the unsheltered community, is because there is no options for housing, and the places where they do end up settling are places that are oftentimes unsafe by their very nature. And so domestic violence housing is an initiative that we're looking at as we think through some of the topics that we talked about here. Housing for, not housing, but youth services. We are seeing an epidemic of youth violence, and in particular, youth gun violence. And so how do we as a community come together to try and think through what is it that we need to do on the prevention, on the intervention, and then what are the targeted enforcement efforts that we really all could agree make the most sense when we're trying to deal with, 30-shot magazines that we're finding casings from routinely at shootings in largely communities of color. So those are a couple of the ideas that are already in play in our legislative proposals right now that I think really come from the conversations about kids with guns or people getting hurt that are living in their cars or traffic stops that could go bad. How do we stop those things? Those are three ideas that we're still working on. They're not to the point of saying they're legislative, but they are definitely on our radar.
Thank you, Commissioner. Phil, you have a couple more questions in chat?
Yes. So there's one, we'll stick with the commissioner here, that came through from Steve. We've lived through a series of public safety incidents in Eden Prairie in the past 90 days, and many of these involved young men with mental health issues. Commissioner, what does the proposed state budget include for conveying or deploying more effective mental health resources and practices to our communities and to our schools?
That really speaks to two things. One, and a conversation we had as part of prepping for this meeting tonight, which is that I really think some of my colleagues, like Commissioner Jan Malcolm and Jody from Department of Health and Human Services, should be involved in these conversations also, because public health and human services are where a lot of those services for those that have mental health challenges really are likely to come from. They're not necessarily going to come from the Department of Public Safety. Having said that, we have been proposing what we call co-responder models and funding from the state to facilitate police, psych, social worker partnerships, so that when we have a crisis call, when the police arrive, we have the right resources that are there so that we can address the core issue, not just the symptom of the issue. The symptom of the issue is oftentimes the fact that this person is talking about hurting themselves or talking about hurting somebody else. Once we get beyond that, though, we have to start thinking about what do we do downstream from that. And so that has been part of Department of Public Safety's initiatives, is co-responder models and more mental health supports that would help both support cops, peace officers, but would also help support their responses on the streets. And we're seeing places that are doing this, but it's too few and not nearly broad enough to be able to give you an accurate sample that says this is working. But I really do think Jody Harpstead and Jan Malcolm, I would love to have them be part of this conversation, because I think they would bring their own disciplines, perspectives to public policy.
Thanks. Phil, I'm going to let you keep rolling.
Yeah. So Commissioner Harrington, another question that came through is kind of talking about the viability of some of this. Are you seeing or hearing bipartisan interest or support for any of these approaches?
I'm seeing some. I'll be real politic. If I saw a lot of it, I'd have had my bills passed through in the last legislative session, and we'd have had the funding for a co-responder and character-based hiring and a bunch of other things that didn't get through. So I've got allies, I'd say, on both sides of the aisle. I need more allies, and I need some of those allies to move into leadership positions so that they can, in fact, call the question and get some bills that were tabled or stuck in a committee brought out of committee and actually see the light of day, where I could then have people testify on behalf of them. And then we might have a really robust bipartisan conversation. But I would say yes, I definitely have allies on both sides of the political line.
Great. Phil?
Yeah, I think we've got time for maybe one more here. Could you, Commissioner Harrington and maybe Randy, a little bit talk a little more about how the one pager was going to be used? I know we talked about it kind of in the middle of this, but just so that we're kind of recapping what all that's about.
I defer to the commissioner on this. Once we get this one pager done, so your eye can go to it, it's succinct, it says what you need to be said. How will you use it? That's the question.
So the short answer to this, to the extent that I've ever been able to give a short answer today, is that when I was in the state legislature, when I was in the state Senate, if I got one letter from a constituent, that represented oftentimes 10,000 people's opinions. That was the litmus test, because so few letters ever got written, or very few calls ever got written. So that the few calls that did come in and the few letters that did come in, especially if they were from my constituents, from my zip code and from my Senate district, we took that and really ran with that as really important information that drove our public policy conversation. And so the idea that we would have not just a person write a letter, but a letter that's signed off and hopefully targeted to the right legislators with churches from their districts. That's not just one person, that's a congregation saying that this is important. And I really do think that will sway, at least it will open minds and open some ideas and open people to conversation, because elected leaders cannot afford to ignore their constituents. So the letter, I think, is a door opener that I hope that will then be followed up with actual conversations and invitations for a real robust community conversation about what we want to do.
Thank you. So let's, Lynn, I'm going to take one last question, Phil, okay, from Lynn. Go ahead, Lynn.
Not a question, well, a question, a wondering, after we get the one pager in place, can we put together a communication strategy that gets this out even beyond our congregations?
Randy, I'm throwing that one to you.
Well, Interfaith Action can certainly publicize the work, Lynn. We can talk about this work, which we think is very important and we think is nonpartisan. This is about, how to draw on what it means to be a faith community, to think about important life and death issues of the day. It's turning to that source of wisdom and engaging each other in a respectful way to come to some shared thinking. So Interfaith Action's happy to publicize the work in its world. We and I don't want to speak for the commissioner, but I'll throw to him to say, how might DPS communications find ways to share this amazing piece of work, both statewide and in national circles. But beyond that, where we could really use your help, Lynn, I think, would be to be getting into national faith circles for the Lilly Endowment to understand what happened here, for seminaries to understand what happened here, and for this, as the last Mentimeter indicated interest in, for this perhaps to become a model for faith communities empowering themselves to use a study and dialogue method like this to consider the pressing issues of the day and to express themselves on those issues.
Good thinking, and we'll continue this conversation offline, but yeah, let's hold the idea. Thank you.
It's yet, we're in the week of the Bringing Faith to Life breakfast. It's yet another way to bring faith to life. Okay, we're going to throw back to the commissioner, if he wants it, for one last few minute segment to maybe let us know a little bit more about how the next 6-8 months are going to unfold at the legislature, and anything else that will affect whether the things that we're expressing may or may not become reality.
And I'm going to say there's a process, and so we have some significant dates coming up. Please vote. I'm not going to use my Chicago joke about how often you should vote, because that's no longer funny given a lot of the crap that we've seen. But we do want you to all get out and vote. So that is absolutely part and parcel of, I think. Once the votes are counted and we have an election that is certified, we will then have a sense of what the legislature and the governor's office and some other key players, constitutional officers are, and that will tell us, that will give us more information about the process we will be going through. I will get to know who in fact will be the chair of the Public Safety Committee in the House, which, because since Carlos Mariani retired last year, we will have a new chair there. There may be new vice chairs and minority leads and some of the other key committees, and also depending on the governor's race, which I'm still very optimistic about. I've got partners who I've mentioned today who I hope will still be in their places because they're doing some really important and really great work. But that will be part and parcel of what we do from November through December, and then January the legislature starts. By that point, we will have budget proposals from all of the cabinet officials that will have already been vetted and fiscal notes done, so that will be ready to go when the legislature is convened. Between now and then, there is an opportunity, and I appreciate that we have Interfaith Breakfast coming up. But we also have a lot of major holidays where people are going to come together. And I'm hopeful that, much as we're having a lot of conversations right now around gun violence. And what we've said to people is we've given out 23,000 gun locks, is that the gun lock is a prop. The conversation is what is essential. I need people in their families to have conversations over the Thanksgiving table and during Hanukkah and during Christmas and all the other, and during the solstice about what does safety look like for their families and for their communities. And I'm hoping that these conversations will help prompt some of that from the pulpit and from, as the Torah is being read. I'm hoping that is part and parcel of the message that's going out, is that we want to have these conversations, because irregardless of what the political world is, the world of crime and violence, unfortunately, is continuing, and we are losing people every day. I just got a report on another double homicide over near my house on the east side of St. Paul. The violence needs to stop, and we need people of good faith to help come together to call that question as to how we can make it stop, or at least work towards its cessation or its reduction. So that would be my short answer. in the process right now. Stay tuned, but more than stay tuned, I'd like you all to be involved. I really was very happy to see the last Mentimeter that said so many people wanted to continue this and continue this work. I think it is important work, but I need you not to be on the sidelines cheering us on. I need you in the game or in the arena with us.
Thank you so much. And so I'm going to jump off of what the commissioner just laid out about the calendar to reinforce once again that we're going to send you a draft by mid-November. And we're going to ask you to start now putting in place whatever process you'll need in your house of worship to decide whether to sign on. So then you'll get it mid-November. You'll have 6 weeks. We hope to get it back by the end of December. Sooner is better. And with that, I want to thank Commissioner John Harrington for wanting to be in this conversation with us, for being a person and a leader who wants to involve the community, and in particular, the faith community, and in particular, in an authentic way, rooted in integrity and an understanding of what faith is, that he wants to bring this to the table in Minnesota and nationally. What a gift your leadership, Commissioner, is to this state, and I think likely to the country. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It's our privilege. I want to thank everyone who was in a leadership position in this process. Nicole, Earl, Michael, Charmaine, Phil, Sarah Paterka, if you're still on, everybody who was in a leadership position here. And I want to thank everyone who was a participant here. Every pastor, every rabbi, every member of a congregation who took a night out of the week or 3 nights out of the week to out of the time period to be in this really challenging, really difficult, really worthwhile discussion. Thank you for being in there with us. And with that, I am going to turn back to Phil for our last set of logistics.
Thanks, Randy. Thank you, everybody. So just a couple of quick housekeeping things for everybody to know. The recording will be available soon, so I'll be sure to send this out to folks who registered, as well as folks who were invited. It will live on our website in the same place as all of our other recordings. And I also want to let you all know that we'll keep you all updated. Obviously, we'll be sending out whatever revised version of the one-pager with the 4 principles to you all for those confirmations and decisions. And we hope to have a forthcoming survey to you pretty quickly. If it's not in your inboxes tomorrow, it should be there early next week. So I just want to let you all know that. And before we do our closing, I'm just going to throw it back really quickly to Charmaine for one last little thing.
Yeah, we just want to give you a chance to give a one-word summary of your experience in this beloved community project. So I put the link back in the chat. You should, if you still have the window open, be able to keep going with the Menti. You see enlightening, rich, hopeful included in the chat as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. I'll now turn it back to Patrice Kelsch. Patrice has graciously agreed to provide us with a closing blessing, and Patrice is a teacher at Common Ground Meditation Center. Patrice, take it away.
So to close tonight, I thought I'd offer a brief loving kindness practice that was actually developed by New York Insight shortly after 9/11, when everyone was feeling raw and scared and uncertain and really felt a sense of peril. So I think this is a suitable prayer for our time, and it's fairly brief. May we be well, safe, and peaceful. May we be free from the suffering caused by fear, anger, and ill will. May we find forgiveness for the inevitable harms we bring to one another. May we cultivate loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. May we live in peace and harmony with all beings. May our families and friends be well, safe, peaceful. May our families and friends be free from the suffering caused by fear, anger, and ill will. May our families and friends find forgiveness for the inevitable harms we bring to one another. May our families and friends cultivate loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. May our families and friends live in peace and harmony with all beings. May all persons everywhere be well, safe, and peaceful. May all persons everywhere be free from the suffering caused by fear, by anger, by ill will. May all persons everywhere find forgiveness for the inevitable harms we bring to one another. May all persons everywhere cultivate loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. May all persons everywhere live in peace and harmony with all beings.